Techlandia is recorded at the Central Office on the East Side in Portland. Central Office is a one stop for all your office or meeting needs. Check them out at centraloffice.com.
Welcome to the latest episode of Techlandia. I'm Skip Newberry, President and CEO of Tao, and this is our regular podcast series. We're excited to have as our guest today, Mohan Nair, and he's a former TAO board member too, so I'm going to be on my best behavior. Mohan, welcome to be with us.
My pleasure. My pleasure to be here, Skip.
And as most people know, I like to start these off by asking folks to share a little bit about their personal journey professionally. So I was wondering if you could just give us some highlights, walk us up to present day.
No problem. Well, I've been in Oregon for since 1977, so it's been a very long time. But so I'm as old as the trees now. But I worked in Intel in 1982, and that was when I took my first job in Oregon. And it was a fascinating time during those years because the internet was just forming. Cognitive databases was my area of specialty in my master's degree. So I was all excited about using that skill to kind of bring intelligence to databases, which is now kind of the language of choice, right? And after that, I worked for three other companies, executive roles, including Mentor Graphics, and did a marketing stint there as a director of marketing, watching it grow from 100 to 500 million. And then two startups, one called Pro Tools and another where I was a chief operating officer. And then also one other startup that came along the way called ABC Technologies that grew from 1.5 million where I was taking charge to about 50 million and then selling to SaaS with an investment from SAP. Those were good, great years of high growth in Oregon and in the startup world. I enjoyed that run, but through that process, I became a consultant and started my own institution called Emerge, where I did consulting work for various large companies as well as mid-sized companies as well as startups. And that gave me a perspective and a humbling that I didn't know much. I had to learn a lot. And in that process, came to the conclusion that Oregon was a great platform to live in, and I continue to live until now. And most recently, if you can call it 5 years ago, I was the chief innovation officer and senior vice president for Cambia Health, where we had the pleasure of launching 10 independent startups in the area of healthcare transformation. Some have survived and they've grown and become very successful. And I had the pleasure of leading a small group of 11 people in an 8,000 person company. But prior to that, I was also the chief marketing officer for Regence Blue Cross Blue Shield, where I had the pleasure of leading a large portion of the front end of the $11 billion institution. So those experiences bring me to today, where I'm an advisor of choice to startups. I'm also on the independent chair of board for a startup in New Zealand. And that relationship in New Zealand has come because I was awarded the Edmund Hillary Fellowship from the country of New Zealand to serve them for a period of 3.5 years to build their ecosystem. You don't get a call to build an ecosystem for a nation very often. So I jumped at the chance and has had the pleasure and continue to have the pleasure of serving their country in the growth of their economy, including their entrepreneurial tendencies in healthcare. So does that kind of put it in perspective as to where I've come so far?
It does. It does. And, over the years, you've also kind of taken that knowledge that you've acquired through experience and shared it. You're an author many times over. And as I understand it, you've also recently worked on another book focused on AI. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, what within AI is captured your attention right now to prompt you to write a book.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of been a pseudo educator for many years, right? I taught at Kellogg School of Business for 13 years, and then I'm on the board, the advisory board of George Fox University. I've been a friend of most of the universities in Oregon because I do believe they are the foundational elements of building the environment we want in Oregon. So that sort of bleed over to education has always made me wonder about the next generation and what it's going to absorb in this new AI world. When I was in 1982, I had hair. Right now, I don't have much. But those years were exciting years. And I thought they were the beginning of a new structural change with the internet, with AI then, and with new areas of business that were just picking up in our wonderful state. I feel just as excited right now as I felt, 35 to 40 years ago. I think this is an incredible time of our lives. It is a restructuring of the elements of our business models that build nations as well as states. AI is a generational one time thing that has happened, and the life has allowed us to see the one person enterprise occur now. It has also allowed us to restructure what we believe is an AI first economy. And the winnings are going to be incredible, but the dangers are also going to be incredible if we don't watch ourselves. So what motivated me was to see the reactions of people in the economy. There's two that I'm seeing, Skip. One is that it's a AI fear economy
Mhm.
where people are just afraid of it and they're saying it's the next Skynet. And then there's an AI obsessive economy where people are saying, come on, if you don't get on board, you're going to be left behind. Those two economies are existing in parallel right now. And so I delved into the what does AI fear mean and what does AI obsession mean, and started to read and research on the implications of fear and obsession and what is the platform that entrepreneurs and company leaders ought to go into, which is the third space, I believe, should be the space that leaders should take a hold of, which is a space I called AI enablement, not fear or obsession. And I can define fear and obsession in more details when you ask, but that was what motivated the book. And I in the book, after 5 years of researching the implications behind AI and Gen AI, and what are the side effects of obsession and fear, I kind of come to a resolutionary output that says that AI enablement and insight coming from individuals has to be trained and enabled in our society. And if we don't invest in our people's ability to create insight, we will be thrown into obsession or fear. That help?
I think that yeah, that dichotomy is kind of fascinating, right? It seems like there's been no middle ground kind of left for folks to occupy. And it's like people are in one of two camps. And there was a survey that was done in September across the Pacific Northwest where AI related sentiment was taken. And the fear was greatest in areas like AI meets education, where people were worried about, cognitive shortcuts taken by students, and we'd effectively lose a generation that's capable because they wouldn't learn. And then there was also on the positive side, in the same markets, in the same regions, a lot of very positive feelings about AI when it comes to human health, right? So yes, more AI when it comes to drug research and scientific breakthroughs, but keep AI out of the classroom. And I found it was really difficult to kind of reconcile those two things because the survey, when it came to education, also pointed to a fear of even having kids learn about AI, not just use it. And that to me is baffling. But I'm wondering, like, in some of your research and some of the conversations you're having, like, what are some of the things you're hearing
Yeah,
when it comes to fear?
I've spent 5 quiet years tortured with this story, talking to several leaders as well as engaging in meta research. I didn't do my own, I didn't institute my own research. I just studied what other people had done. 5 years ago, there was only an inkling of this anxiety. Now it's in full blown anxiety attack over these issues. So what am I finding? I think your paradox you're finding where it says don't teach our children, but let's manage it ourselves is an interesting paradox. There are a series of other paradoxes as well. Fear, I can only tell stories. So think of a McKinsey report that came out 2 years ago with 1,000 participants, and they just did an analysis on what holds back innovation. And in those 1,000 participants, they discovered that the number one factor for holding back any form of transformational innovation is fear. And they define fear as individuals who are worried about their career, who are worried about uncertainty, and they are also worried about loss of control. Those three they call an ambiguity effect that's forming the callus that doesn't allow for transformative innovation to get into larger institutions. And they found that the companies that really broke through are not the ones that overcame these tendencies, but they create systems to allow for these tendencies to be lessened. And so that fear is happening right now in AI, where people are saying, let's get away from it. I'm losing my job. So career implication. I don't know what it is, so I'm not going to find out. And I don't have any control over it, so I'm just going to run. That effect is now multiplied tenfold from the research done 3 years ago, because that was not an AI research paper. That was just a paper on what's going to happen with innovation. So you can see the parallels between a lack of innovative tendency with AI and a fear of them losing control over AI and their jobs. That is going to be even worse as time passes, unless we do something in our society, enable it, and corporations do something to structurally transform people while you're transforming the business model with AI. And that lack of not giving people readiness training and education is a major factor. Now, then you go to the education part and you're saying, oh my, what's going to happen? These kids are going to come up with cognitive loads that are not going to work. And that is actually real. It is a function of the research I've discovered that the younger, less experienced, cognitively used individuals are going to offload more onto AI, Gen AI. And that offloading prior to them forming their own cognitive capacity and capability will degrade their cognitive capabilities significantly. And that is the theory that currently is the most anxious, what they call cognitive atrophy.
Mhm.
And there are certain habits that AI obsession, I call it AI obsession only to get attention, right? I mean, it's a good word to get people saying, I don't want to be obsessive. And it just creates a certain identity. And in the book, I create that identity. But people are dating using Gen AI. They're not just using the internet to date each other. They're now taking the responses from the other party that they want to date and they're putting it into Gen AI and they're saying, what is my response? I know people who are doing this.
Mhm.
They're asking it everything. Like, how do I deal with my life? How do I deal with my anxiety? They're they're asking for personal guidance on career, on focus. It is becoming habitual and almost obsessive in terms of giving away their first opinion. In other
Mhm.
words, they're not forming their first opinion. They're asking the machine to develop it and that they're becoming editors of their first opinion. And they're going for the most convenient answer rather than taxing their brain, which they should at this age, to go beyond good enough to better than enough. You know?
Yep. Yep. Yeah, and before we dive a little bit more into this idea of AI enablement and what it entails, especially with respect to how we invest in our people, I'm wondering, are there certain areas when it comes to, fear where you feel like healthy dose of skepticism is important when it comes to AI? And what are the areas that you think are in the short term, legitimate enough for folks to, yeah, lose some sleep cycles on occasionally, at least to be thinking about and keeping top of mind?
Yeah. You have to forgive me, Skip. The area of focus that I decided to do 5 years ago was not to think about corporate governance of AI because a
Mhm.
lot of people are doing great work in that area. They're talking about governmental's work, they're talking about sovereign AI, and they're also focusing on the challenges associated with corporate AI management and how to get employees to function in this AI world. That's not I decided not to write a book or do research in the area because I knew that would be a very crowded space. What doesn't seem crowded is individuals, people, just general families, and what's happening in the dinner table, and what's happening to your kids, and what's happening to executives who are personally worried about their own future, let alone the next generation. So, my focus was really about the research that they can understand on over conveniencing your world, over good enoughing your world, and over giving up your first opinion. And I'm saying, don't be obsessive, but don't be afraid, but how about you understand what enablement means? And to do that, I had to kind of understand what are the side effects of over obsession, because that's where most people will say, I don't want to go there. So I had to do the research on what are the main side effects. But I have come to a conclusion that there is an answer for cognitive atrophy delaying. There is an answer that is human centered. And I can share that with you at the appropriate time. But first, let's talk about what does obsession mean and what are the implications, the scientific implications in brain theory and neuroscience, as well as in cognitive science, that have already been done that give you a taste of what this means.
So if we think about, areas where things maybe have been taken a little too far,
Right.
with AI, what are some concrete examples where you've seen some stuff where it should rightly give people pause?
So let me
Yeah.
let me go to the research because that is more appropriate than my sort of observations, because I tried not to be an observant person in this category, and I tried to get to the research. They looked at 172 candidates in a study a while ago by Betsy Sparrow. I think it was at Columbus University, where they had studied the use of the Google search engine, just Google, right? And they found that people using Google to write a paper or to analyze a subject were prone to search for the answers very effectively. And they use Google as almost an extended brain. And they found that what they termed the Google effect, which is they knew where to find it, but it was about 1 minute to 2 minutes before they could remember what the subject was. In other words, their memory was not triggered. The only thing that was triggered is their mechanics on searching for something. So, what is not remembered is not cognitively managed, if you know what I'm saying.
Yep.
So, from a neural perspective, if you don't store it in your memory glands in your brain, you probably don't process it overnight. And so it never goes anywhere. So, that's one. Another study was real simple. It was done by taxi cab drivers. They studied taxi cab, London cab drivers, and they studied the hippocampus of these London drivers in using maps. And they found that the people who used maps, our standard mapping stuff that we use, the gray matter was, the posterior gray matter wasn't growing. In fact, it was
Hmm.
shrinking. They found that people who didn't use those maps and used their own sight navigation, internal navigational capability in their brain, they were growing their gray matter. So I was in a hotel in London just 2 weeks ago. I asked a bellman directions. I said, how do I get from this spot to the bridge, London Bridge? And he said, oh, I don't have my phone with me. I can't help you. I mean, what does that tell you? Right? A bellman used to tell you where things are, but
Yeah.
they don't. They've given up that part of the hippocampus. They've they've enabled their brain to say, not necessary. I'll find another way. So those are just basics. But if you take it to another level, and you draw out more research, you find that 600 plus candidates were taken by the Swiss Business School, the Center for Cognitive Foresight. And they found when they're using tools that the younger, less educated individuals offloaded more of their brain to the cognitive machine and therefore were not firing all of the elements of their brain. And that the older, so there's hope for people like you and me, the older individuals were doing much more critical thinking and much more firing of their brains, both left, right, center, up, and above of their muscle called the brain. And they found that those individuals did more. So look at what that implies. If you take that research, which is unfair, and apply it to community, you will find that if we apply these technologies to younger minds, they will cognitively offload more, and the less educated will offload more, and the more educated will offload less, and the older would offload less, and the younger will offload more. The implications are significant if I were to make that brash assumption. There's more research to be done. There's seriously more research to be analyzed. But this is where things go too far. they took 54 students in MIT Media Lab, and they did a study on them. They separated them in three groups. That should be an analysis by itself. 54 divided by three. One group got more person. We know that. But they separated them to LLM only, large language model only usage, search engine only, and they also took brain only, which is interesting. And they separated them and said, write a paper on a subject that you know, so you don't have to do extensive searching. They then took all those papers, those 54 papers, and gave it in front of other teachers to review the papers. They also did EEG studies of every brain in that room, 54 brains. And what they found, which is obvious, the ones who did LLM only paper writing did not fire cognitively in their brain much. They fired some, but they didn't fire a lot. The LLM only did not fire much. The search engine was middle, so it's the three bears and the three bears, right?
Yep.
Um, and the smallest bear that used brain only wrote papers that the researchers who were analyzing the work, the teachers who were analyzing the work, who had no idea what the source was, found were better written, more motivational, and they felt like the authors were more involved and had the largest firing of the brain. So if we do extend these studies to communities in the future, we do need some understanding of guardrails and know how to coach the mental capacity of each one of these individuals depending on their state and reference.
So it sounds to me like there's huge opportunities when we talk about enablement, right?
Yes,
Where there needs to be far more involvement on the part of humans in not only setting out the frameworks that help define where AI can be applied, but also how and then also the people that are working with the AI need to be coached, trained, recoached, and kind of held accountable. And I was having a conversation earlier this week with a chief people officer, and she was saying she's working a lot more with their CTO around helping to define areas where automated decision systems exclusively are being implemented, areas where it's a hybrid with
yep,
humans and automated decision systems, and then
right.
areas where they don't want anything automated, it's exclusively humans. And to your point, there are some things that we have more to lose than gain in trying to insert AI into the process. And it's
Right.
defining those areas that's going to be vital for any organization or any family unit.
Yes, it takes all levels, and that's why I wrote the book for the dinner table. I
Mhm.
didn't write it for the organizational structures, although it has major implications. But because in the end of the day, another study came up where AI is being really used, and it's being used by executives in their homes,
Yep.
right? So it's more in the home than it is in the workplace today, and that's fine. That's what advanced technologies apply and allow. So the question that I'm asking myself in writing this book is, if Google is your extended brain and search engines are your extended brain, what's going to happen when you have an extended brain that's really a brain, right? Are you going to extend your brain or are you going to offload your brain? And what does that do to the generation of individuals? Now, that paints a very frightening picture. I really have much more hope than I'm delivering right now. The hope I'm delivering is that I think there is a way to match the machine and rise to the needs of the machine by also growing your own cognitive, innovative capability. And of course, I come back to my field of work that I've spent the last 30, 40 years doing, which is how to innovate in a transformational way, not
Mhm.
just an incremental, because the incremental innovation mindset is going to be machine readable by most people. In other words, preserving your environment in status quo, managing using history. How else can I put it? Top down management, remove the unmeasurables because they're too soft, and then just investigate everything and then build what you think the customer wants. That model is going to be machine readable. And when it's machine readable, it'll be machine replaceable. So if you're in that field of preserving the status quo, managing using history, which the machine can do 10 times better than you will be machine replaced. And so the idea of being unreplaceable or unreachable, which is the title of my book, haha, comes from really challenging the future, using history as guide, but making history, not using history, using a bottom up thinking that is using insight as your true superpower, not your eyesight or your foresight or the other sides of the mind.
Mhm.
Hindsight. You can use all those sites, but those sites are all captured by a machine. The only thing that the machine is unable to do, studying cognitive science and studying innovation science, is that the aha is not that easy for a machine to have. Machines don't get ahas. They get combinatorial solutions. We get ahas. Human beings are an incredible thing. The human mind is capacitated with the ability to experiment and fail, explore, get an opinion, and then form an aha in the middle of the night or walking your dog or taking a shower. And the number of those ahas create things like the just do it story from our famous late creative scientist, right?
Mhm.
I mean, copying Gary Gilmore's story in his head and then suddenly spitting it out to Nike and changing the Nike identity, right?
Yep.
That kind of stuff just doesn't happen by a machine, right? A machine cannot be inside powered. Humans can. So the question is, how much of this work are we doing in our economy in Oregon to grow insight centered thinkers
Mhm.
that can use the machinery as part of their toolkit, but not be subsumed by the toolkit for every opinion? How do they get that more ahas inside them? And that's what the book is finally resting on and the research is resting on. And then I, of course, talk about ways in which you can do that. But I think there is a wider picture that you and I are talking about. It's what to do with Oregon, right?
Yep. Yep.
We are inside powered individuals. We have that in our bloodstream. Why are we relying on eyesight, foresight, and eyesight only, right?
Right.
And what is the neurological capacity we can enable in our young minds in this state and grow in scaffolding so people can climb?
Well, I feel like it's interesting because the survey results were such that we alluded to earlier, where the greatest amount of fear in use of AI and studying of AI is in education, and yet that is probably the one area that has the most near term, most profound, potentially positive implications in providing people with a sense of agency that allows them to kind of dispel their anxiety, right? To mitigate their anxiety. Because if they have greater agency, if they understand where AI succeeds and where it fails, they can be better at choosing the path and empowering themselves to become better in areas where AI is never going to get there,
Right.
right?
And we have to turn from being educators to explorers
Yep.
because you and I know the younger ones are faster at adapting to this stuff than we are.
Hmm.
And if you go into a university setting or an environment of higher learning or any kind of educational institution, where is exploration skills taught? Experimentation, failure, the idea that you have a map, but you don't think the map is correct and you have to seek and respond. Those skills are not taught. They're generally hidden in some storyline somewhere. And that's why it's not just scientific learning, which is the art of breaking stories down to narratives and then sub narratives, but it's also liberal arts education that allows you to explore these kinds of stories.
Hmm.
And the combination of the two is vitally important in creating the right platform for learning, right? Which is fundamentally exciting to me. It's very exciting that AI is challenging the fundamental premise of how we all think and
Hmm.
how we engage in our thoughts and who owns thought. I think that test has finally arrived, and I think it's been a journey since 1977 that I've tried to study the mind of the machines, and now the machines are trying to teach us what the mind looks like. And it's time for us to step up and be human capacity way beyond the machine. And I believe we can be.
Well, there's a nice sort of hopeful sentiment as we wind down our conversation. I wanted to, before we wrap up, ask you, I mean, this is a pretty complex, fast moving area. In some of your research and in some of the work you're doing, what book, or are there certain podcasts you've listened to that have, really left a mark on you where you think it might be worthwhile sharing with our listeners?
Well, Aidan McCullen, who runs the Innovation podcast, is my one of my favorites. I known him and have enjoyed him. He's a friend and incredibly honorable person, and so his love for knowledge is pretty big and very strong. And I think he brings thinkers together, and he has access to them. I'm hoping to be on his podcast sometime next year, but I've always listened to his work and found it very intriguing in terms of understanding how innovation works at a micro and macro level. As to books, I've been trying to work on my own books, so it's hard to say that I've not read everything I can possibly put my hands on in terms of the AI world. But the one that's really interesting is Karen Ho's book on Empires of AI. That brings a backstory to all the tech individuals in the world of AI and brings them into a storyline that makes them human.
Mhm.
And that sense of making them human allows you agency to realize that you have to own your own narrative rather than be educated by everybody else's narrative. And it's a tendency we see in our world today where people are so busy listening to every other voice, they forget their own inner voice. And I think it's important to train young minds and to remind older minds that that which within you is highly capacitated. It is 300,000 years of evolution that you can use in the practice of innovation to find that aha that makes you really build scaffolding so others can climb. Our obligation for the older generation is to not leave it the way it is now, but to leave it better. And I see that storyline playing heavily with AI being the wake up call for us. And I hope that this podcast and others allow me not to be pedantic, but to appeal to the audience and say, let's work together and find new ways. Let's explore together. Let's not be experts. Let's be explorers, because there is no room for experts in the world that's changing every second. There are only room for people who understand the humility of exploration. Does that help?
It does. I love it. I always love chatting with you, and it's always hopeful and inspiring. And even when we're talking about challenges, and that's what I love about it. So, Mohan, I just want to say thanks for taking some time out of your schedule to share some wisdom with us. And when can folks expect to be able to get your book?
The book will come out sometime in the first quarter of next year. It is supported by Fast Company, so it'll be under the imprint of Fast Company. And so they'll be doing some advertising, and my publisher will also do some advertising. But, I like selling books. It's the only way you really win, right? When people buy your stuff, then they actually realize it's important. So I'm not far from being a commercial capitalist and enjoy that process. But it's also great to have people like you supporting me, Skip. And I'm always grateful for your sense of commitment to Oregon and your sense of commitment to the society you serve. And I will always serve those who serve, and you're one of them.
Well, thank you. That means a lot, Mohan. And we'll be sure to share with our listeners when your book is available. And in the meantime, thanks for joining us, everyone.
My pleasure. Take care of yourselves.
That's a wrap on this episode of Techlandia, the podcast, where innovation meets insight. If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to follow us, leave a review, and share it with your fellow tech explorers. You can follow us at techoregon.org for updates and more tech-fueled content. Until next time, stay curious, stay connected, and keep building the future.